Hi and welcome to AXSchat. We've got the toughest interview in the world today because we're interviewing Debra. Debra's got a book coming out in the next few weeks. It's either going to be late December or early January, and it's called Uncovering Hidden Human Capital, How Leading Corporations Leverage Multiple Abilities in Their Workforce. So nice and short title there, but I'm sure it's going to be excellent. So really pleased that you're getting to see the light of day with this book, Debra. I know you've been working on it for an awful long time, and the only reason we don't have a set date at the moment is because of the typesetters. So it's imminent. So tell us a bit more about the book.
Well, first of all, thank y'all for having me on AXSchat. You're right, Neil. It has taken almost 2 years to create this book. And the book is about employing people with disabilities, but it's from the employer's perspective. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't want to just speak from, when I first started it, I didn't want to speak just from the U.S. perspective. Even though I live in Virginia, I really wanted it to be a global exploration of, what was happening all over the world and what could we learn from each other. And so I wrote, I started writing the book, and then I was talking to Axel Lebois, the CEO of G3 ICT, and I told him what I was doing, and he said, we would really love to be the publisher. And so, that's how that came about. And I've rewritten the book probably about 5, 6, 7, 8 times, but that's okay too, because the topic has changed a lot in several years, and I think it's very important that we have the right information in there. It's targeted towards CEOs, because we really want them to understand that they could actually be successful in employing people with disabilities, and we want to make sure that we brag about the corporations, the organizations all over the world that are actually successfully doing it.
Okay, and just for our viewers that have joined it in the last few months, so G3 ICT is the accessible technology arm of the United Nations, and Axel Lebois is the CEO, and you can go back through our archive and see our interview with Axel too. So it's exciting, really. I think it's great that you're doing it from a different viewpoint. What about, so I know you're addressing it with the CEO level. Have you been also addressing it with the sort of the head of HR level, or is that something that you feel has already been addressed, and so it's coming at it from a completely different angle?
Well, and that's a really good point, because I say I'm looking at it at the CEO level, but to be honest, it's not just the CEO level. I mean, what I wanted to do when I was writing it, and I remember Axel, who is a mentor of mine, he was saying, think about the business books you like to read, Debra, and, think about a CEO in the United States or the United Kingdom or in India, reading about this, get to the point almost. I write like I talk. I have a tendency to overtalk. And so it is created for the HR manager. It is created for the strategist in the company. It's created for the C-level. But it explores every single aspect of the HR, journey. From not only employing people with disabilities and accommodating people with disabilities, but retaining people with disabilities as well. And it talks about, it goes through a typical corporation, in that, what does the marketing department need to be thinking about when they're thinking about this topic? What does operations need to think about? What about, the product development people? What about the IT department and my website and my intranet and my training? I mean, this is such a, as we know on AXSchat, it's such a multi-dimensional topic. So not only are we talking about candidates, with disabilities, but we're talking about employees with disabilities, hidden and visible disabilities. We're talking about accommodations, and then of course you have to talk about, since many of the corporations that I feature in the book are multinational corporations, not all of them. Some of them, for example, I feature Woolworth from Australia, and SAP in Germany, but SAP, of course, is all over the world. And so I interview leaders like Susan Scott Parker, also a former AXSchat guest. And what's happening, what are they doing with that part of the organization that, Neil, I know you're very active in. And so it's really designed, it's not designed, I will say it's not designed to tell you every single thing you ever need to know, but it is, it's sort of designed to set the playing field, a level playing field. So as an employer, what do I need to do, and what steps do I need to take, and how do I reduce my risks? So things like that.
No, we have been talking about the importance of the book and in terms of the private sector. How about the public sector and government? Do you think that people that are leaders from government can also take advantage from what we have explored on this book?
Well, and that's a great point, Antonio, because yes, I do think so. I do speak mostly the examples that I provide are from corporations, global corporations all over the world, but it is for employers. So whether you have 10,000 employees at your government agency, or you're part of a 5-person nonprofit or a small business or corporation, what I talk about in the book and the journey that many of these corporations have taken can be applied across the board. It talks about the risks aspect as well as the carrot aspect, your brand aspect, the marketing. I really tried to capture the landscape of it and then actually talk about who is successfully doing it and supporting it, supporting these efforts as well. I also talk about, I mentioned this in one of our interviews, our past interviews a couple of weeks ago, but, and I know, Neil, you were surprised when I said this, but one of the findings in the book was what was happening in France. And we found that in France, many times over the last years, instead of employing people with disabilities, we saw many of the corporations just paying the fines. And yet then the government stepped in and said, well, maybe what we need to do with these corporations is provide them with more supports. And so they had service providers step in and start helping these corporations. And we saw the amount of people with disabilities getting employed in France really go up, the amount of penalties that were being paid go down. And so there's some interesting statistical information in the book that is being captured from all over the world, and also from the UN and from the International Labor Organization, from the disability, the Business Disability Forum, for example. So just trying to capture the data that we know is there and put it in one place.
Let me tell you a story that happened recently on the recent elections for the Portuguese Parliament. So we have laws that in relation to accessibility for more than 20 years. And in the Parliament, they came across recently in the last elections that they have one of their members has a disability and is using a wheelchair. So the place where they have approved all the regulations and where they spend a huge amount of money renewing the building just about 4 or 5 years ago is a place that is not accessible at all. So, and there were some interesting videos and interviews in national television where they were showing you the Portuguese Parliament and the struggle of the person in a wheelchair to move within the Parliament. So, countries have regulation in place for so many years, but sometimes it just doesn't work.
No, I agree, and I think we all know that the regulations can be there and never enforced. So I think you've got a chapter or a part of the book exploring the global carrot and stick, and I think it's really interesting to see the different approaches in the different parts of the globe as to who applies more carrot and who applies more stick. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that, because we're sat here from our national perspective.
Well, one thing that happens, as you know, I travel all over the world speaking about these topics, and I believe, at least in the beginning, when I started being invited about 5, 6 years ago to speak, sometimes I was invited because I was from the U.S. and the countries that were inviting me, a lot of the countries are developing countries. They just were assumed the United States had nailed it because we just celebrated our 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I pretty much have to say, well, we haven't really nailed it yet. We've had amazing progress, but there's a lot of work to do, and the United States actually is learning a lot from looking at what other countries are doing more successfully. One thing that we are doing in the United States is we have that stick out, and we're beating the corporations with it. We got it out, and we're just whipping them. And we actually have sort of had a reverse thing happen there, in that we're having so many lawsuits, all of them settle, and that there are law firms that, and we talked about this a little bit when we interviewed Lainey a few weeks ago on AXSchat, but there are actually law firms that are making a lot of money by just suing our corporations and saying, your websites aren't accessible, and so we're going to sue you. And then the corporations don't make the websites more accessible. They just pay the lawyers money to go away. They just settle. And then they get sued again and again and again. And so it has become a real problem in the United States. Yes, it's very counterproductive. And you know who loses, Neil, are the people with disabilities, because we still don't have access to the websites.
Yeah. So then you want someone that doesn't want to. So then you need someone that doesn't want to settle, or you need someone like Lainey that's going to do some structured negotiation.
Right.
So, and so with all this story, there's a group that is actually not benefiting from this. So people who actually need access,
yes,
they don't get any benefits from those stories.
Right. But a lot of lawyers are making a whole bunch of money, and some accessibility experts are making good money as they, advise the lawyers. And we're all about capitalism in the U.S. And I appreciate that, but it's a very disturbing trend. And our lawsuits are way up in the U.S. And so once again, there's a lot of really, really, really good stuff that happens in the U.S. as well. But if you're a corporation in the U.S. trying to include people with disabilities, there's a lot of fear. And I remember being on a phone call once with a lot of other leaders and corporations, and there was a group leading it, who I will not name, and they were saying, we just wish employers would stop being so afraid in the United States about employing people with disabilities. Why are y'all so afraid of us? What? And I was like, because we're suing them, and because we take their brands and we drag them through the mud, and that's why they're afraid of us. Often it's not seen as a partnership. Of course, it's not. I'm generalizing, but we got that stick out so well in the United States that it is actually, I think, slowed us down. And so, as I looked at all this, and being a very big advocate, but also working in corporate America for many, many years, I just really wanted to write a book that showed employers that they could successfully do this. And by the way, you have already hired people with disabilities in your workforce. You've already successfully done it. Maybe they haven't self-identified. Maybe you don't realize you've already accommodated them, but just demystify some of it. And once again, look at this from a global perspective of what can we learn from other countries in the U.S. and each other. I mean, for example, in Egypt, I've done a lot of work in Egypt, and Egypt they did this really amazing program where they trained 100 people, it was really 110 people that were blind to do different technology positions. And they didn't want to have employment outcomes because they were afraid maybe, that it would be hard to achieve. Well, then they actually had a 70%, 70% employment rate for those people that were blind. And so that is something to talk about and to celebrate. In the U.S., we aren't often seeing a 70% success rate in employing people with disabilities. And so I think we really need to learn from each other and really look and see who's doing it right, and once again, not who's doing it right, because it's a really multidimensional situation, but what can we learn from each other, and what programs are out there that it's like, wow, why did they have those successes in Egypt, for example? What can we learn from that?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting learning from that. In the UK and parts of Europe, I think that we probably need to get the stick out in terms of accessibility, at least. I think that's different from the quota systems, because the quota systems, they've had the punitive approach. You talked about how it doesn't always work, but equally there are laws out there right now that are just not being enforced. So there needs to be that balance. I totally get what you're saying in the States about the punitive side of things going too far, but I think in the UK we probably need a couple of test cases, and that's all I think it needs. It doesn't need everyone to sue everyone consistently, but you do need some kind of test cases to make the point, to show that the law has teeth. Because at the moment, I honestly feel that you're going to be gummed to death by the law. It has no teeth. So
I agree.
So I think it's about finding that balance. I know you said that you were approached by G3 ICT to publish as the publisher, but what made you say yes?
Well, thank you for asking that question. G3 ICT, I have been a longtime volunteer, and I actually do consulting work with them as well. And I really, really like who G3 ICT is. G3 ICT is a nonprofit that is a global nonprofit that focuses on helping countries and entities actually implement. At first, they implement the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. At first, they were just raising awareness and really trying to get countries to understand the importance of signing and ratifying it. Now we have 160 countries that have signed the convention, so there's some real success there. Now they're working to get, along with other groups, to help countries implement the convention. And it sort of goes back to what you were just saying, Neil. You've got laws all over the world on these issues, and most of them are just being ignored. And we see quota systems. People are just ignoring the quota system. The quota systems that we see any kind of movement on usually have supports tied around them so that they actually can, help employers understand the steps they need to take to meaningfully employ and retain people with disabilities. But if you just put a law out there and you do not in any way enforce it or give it any kind of teeth, we're seeing nothing being done. So there's so much work. And whenever we see big lawsuits happening, when we're talking about them in the United States, because once again, everybody settles. You do not want to be the brand that is not going to include people with disabilities. Really? So you don't want your brand to get into that particular conversation in a negative way. But if we didn't have that, I don't think we would have had the successes that we have had in the United States. I think one thing the United States can very proudly say is that we were one of the first starters in this conversation. And we did it by people with disabilities fighting for their rights and dragging themselves up our court steps in Washington, D.C. And, applause to all of those people that fought for their rights. And that's happening all over the world. But there's still so much work to do to meaningfully, really meaningfully include people with disabilities in the workforce.
Okay. So, one of the topics that's also really close to my heart is around the whole design piece. I'm very hot on usability and user experience, and obviously, when we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about the user experience for people with disabilities. So, I know that that's another area that you've covered in your book. So, can you tell us a little bit about that too?
Yes, and that's another thing that G3ICT focuses on is, certainly the convention as a whole, but their focus is making sure that ICT, internet communications, and technology is accessible to all of us. And so that really appealed to me as a publisher. Axel Leblois has been a CEO of many very, very, very large corporations all over the world, and one of his former CEO positions, he had a very large training organization, and they did thousands of books. So when he was saying, we'd really like to, start getting involved again in publishing books that are very meaningful to people with disabilities. And so that was another reason why. But I think the accessibility part of it is just such an important part. And that's a field I've been in since, early 2000. And, helping corporations, helping all organizations understand that when you make your website more accessible to people with disabilities, it improves the customer experience for all of your customers, your older customers, your customers that might, have a different native language than the one that you have your information in. So it makes it better for everybody. So accessibility is just such a really important part of it. And we all through the book, I weave accessibility and marketing into it, even though the book is on employment. It's on employability. I don't think you can have a conversation with employers about employing people with disabilities and retaining them without talking about accessibility and talking about, marketing and how every aspect of the organization fits into this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. You've got employee brand. Disabled
Right.
employees are part of your employee brand. Oh, Antonio's got I know you've got a question.
I do. So, for what I was able to understand, one of the purpose of your book is to inspire people, to inspire companies to create more confidence in the way how they hire people with disabilities.
Yes, and I think it's very important. I mean, we're going to start the book off in English, and then we're also going to translate it into all of the 9, UN languages as we move forward, and any other language that people will let us translate it in. But and of course, it would be great. We also want it to be an audio version so that everyone that needs access to it can have access to it. We want it to be a book that's very accessible to the readers. But it's, I think it was so important as I was writing the book. Once again, I wrote it many times, but I really, really like, I'm really proud of what the book became after many, iterations of it, and a lot of support from G3ICT. But it's sometimes when I read the book, I think I know that people already know this information, but it seems like employers don't always know this information, that you can't say, yes, we hire people with disabilities and then have an inaccessible career center. Oh, so wait a minute. So you hire people with disabilities. Does that include blind people? Well, I'm blind and I go to submit my resume, which is the only way that I can apply for a job with you, and it's not accessible. Well, then I'm sorry, are you including us or aren't you? So, and what about the person, the employee that already works for you that loses their sight? 80% of disabilities happen after we're born. Now, I mean, my daughter was born with Down syndrome, but most of us acquire a disability, later, as we live our life, as we follow the journey of our lives. So things like that in some way it feels common sense to me, but I think it's things that employers haven't thought about. How do you accommodate all of your employees?
Now, if we go back to the history of accessibility and at the workplace, uh, what part of that is your book trying to cover? The importance of technology, or in the end, this is all mainly about people, and sometimes technology is just there to help. We just need to work around the people and around the knowledge in relation to accessibility.
Well, and well said, Antonio, because employment is about people. But we need to make sure that we use all of the technological tools that we have at our disposal to make sure that all of your employees, can participate in the very best way they can, and that they can be productive. And the book really encourages employers to think outside the box themselves. So you want innovative, creative employees. Well, who better to have than somebody that thinks differently than another person? Some of our greatest minds are people with dyslexia and ADHD and the neurodiversity. It adds such value to the workforce and the productivity and the innovation. So I think it's got to be about people, but we've got to make sure that we're using all of the technology and all the tools that we have at our disposal so that we can all, be successful. And always with the bottom line goal of the corporation or the employer being successful. I remember one time I was I was training a group of people in Singapore, and they were service providers. And I said to them, who is your customer? Is your customer the person with the disability that you're trying to get employed, or is the employer your customer? And so several of them said, well, it's the person with a disability. And I said, well, that's really, no, it's got to be both. But you've got to want the employer to have a successful outcome, because many times employers, especially when we're employing people with intellectual disabilities, they'll try hiring one person. That's a lot of pressure on that one person. Hope they do a good job, otherwise that employer's not going to try again, right? And so just, looking at it, it like that, to think about, how do we use technology to accommodate all of our employees?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we want all of our employees to be productive. Neil, you've got a team of 60 people working for you. You need all of your employees to be productive.
Okay, so yeah, it's more like 16, but effectively, everyone, you want to create the ecosystem within which people can thrive, and that requires organizational change, attitudinal change, looking at processes, looking at systems. And that can be big and scary. When you say, oh yeah, well, it's not just about your website. Have you thought about this, and you keep on listing, and you can see either they get the look of the rabbit in the headlights, or you can see them glazing over and thinking, yeah, they're too hard next. So
right.
So how do you strike that balance? Have you given people some advice in the book as to how to address that in a way without actually scaring them so much that they don't want to take that step and start employing people?
Well, and you're right. It can be really scary, and you start naming off all the things they have to do, and it's like, I'm just going to put the covers over my head because now I'm just totally. I was scared before. Now I'm really scared. So I do offer in the book suggestions on, first of all, I assure them and I give them grounded examples. I think you should always give very grounded examples. And I give grounded examples of employers that have actually been successful. But I talk about, what they should do and assure them they have already done many of these things. There's an example I use. I was interviewed one time by a television reporter, and I knew what they were saying, but I was going to be a little cheeky. And they were saying, so, tell us about it, accommodating employees. And I knew what they meant, but I said, well, I, as an employer, I accommodated one of my employees whose wife was going to have their first baby. I know that when a baby comes into a household, it can be very disruptive. Nobody's sleeping. And so I accommodated him with very flexible hours. I accommodated another employee that wanted to take Tuesdays at 2 o'clock off so he could coach his daughter's soccer. I also accommodate employees that need screen readers so they can be productive. And I accommodate employees. So you remind the employers, and I do this throughout the book, that we accommodate employees so that they're productive. And so I tell them what they need to do, and I give them examples, grounded examples, to help them understand they already know how to do some of this. And then I provide I do provide information. Some of it I've gotten from the Employers Disability Forum that you're part of, Neil, under Susan Scott Parker. There's some wonderful resources out there about is technology a cost of barrier? Is providing this technology a reason not to employ these people? And so I provide information that's coming out of Australia and out of the UK and out of AXSchat, job accommodation networks in the United States, about how we know that the cost of accommodation is not a barrier to employing people. And so I try to give them resources along the way, Neil, because some of it they can do themselves, but some of it, maybe you do need to go out and hire some accessibility consultants to give you a First thing I would say is don't just go do an accessibility test. Put a strategy in place, and we talk about strategy and processes and how important that is. Bring in an accessibility expert if you need to create a roadmap, and then decide where you have expertise and where you need to go out and get the expertise, and then manage the roadmap. And so I try to roadmap all of the processes that they need to take, and assure them that some of this you already know and you're already doing it. Some of them, go out and get the experts, but don't do it until you have a plan, or you might just be throwing money against the wall and letting it slide down the wall, and then you're not successful. And I'll give you an example of that. There was a transportation company in one of the states in the United States, and they had a client complain because she said that the bus schedules were not accessible. So what they did was they went out and they took the bus schedules and they made them all Braille. And it cost them they told me they spent $25,000. And I just shook my head and I said, so how did that work? And they said, well, the problem with doing it that way is that we find that many of our customers don't read Braille, even if they're blind, and our bus schedules sometimes change every 15 minutes. And I said, well, you could have just gone out and made your website accessible, and the Word document, they were using Word for the schedule, and then it's accessible to everybody. So they wasted, God bless them, that $25,000 trying to do the right thing, right?
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot of money on embossed paper.
Yes.
Just immediately out of date. That's okay.
Yeah,
Good
it
example.
was discouraging. Yeah, so it's exciting.
So no, that's great. So I'm looking forward to getting my signed copy.
Well, since I quote you in the book, I will definitely do that, Neil.
Yeah. Okay. So super. So I think we're at the end of our half hour. It's been nice to actually talk to you instead of talking to someone else for a change. So thank you very much, Debra.
Thank you,
Yes,
Debra.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.